So I just want to welcome everyone again. My name is Milda Jilinskaite. You should see on the screen my colleague Aida Jairo and our wonderful panelists Dilip Ratha from the World Bank, John Cantwell from Rutgers University, Mathias Czaika from University for Continuing Education Krems, and Pitelis from the University of Leeds. Thank you all for joining us.
So my name is Aida Jairo. Today's event titled Migration and Business, Exploring the Dynamics Behind Remittances, Cross-Border Activities of Firms and Economic Globalization is co-hosted by Migration, Business and Society, the Center for International Business at the University Leeds, CEPOL, and the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, known as KNOMAD, established by the World Bank.
And not only are we happy about having 4 prominent speakers today, it is really wonderful to see the variety and range of expertise among our audience. So thank you for saying hello to each other in the chat. Given that this is a webinar format, we realize that you as audience members probably cannot see each other, but we just wanted to point out that we received 270 registrations. We looked at their profiles. They're people from 36 countries. Many are academics from different universities and business schools. And we're also delighted to see already in the chat experts from the World Bank, the International Organization for Migration, Global Coalition for Migration, Migrant Forum, OECD, International Finance Corporation, Ministry of Health Austria, Foreign and Commonwealth Office UK, and State Bank of Pakistan, and I could keep listing. And we also see representatives from multinational corporations like Flex and Western Union. So very warm welcome to all of you.
So now to the contents of today's webinar, it goes without saying that the implications of migration for development, economic prosperity, and cross-border activities of firms are undeniable. One of the most transformative processes of migration are migrant remittances. The demand created by migrants' investments in their home countries supports the expansion of the market for multinational firms and also encourages local firms to go abroad themselves. This is why the topic migration is so important for policymakers, business leaders, and scholars. So we are grateful to our speakers today. To maximize our time with them, we will not provide detailed biographies, although all of them are very well known in their fields. So our first speaker is Dilip Ratha. Dilip is head of KNOMAD and lead economist, migration and remittances, social protection and jobs global practice at the World Bank. For those of you who don't know KNOMAD, it's a global hub of knowledge and policy expertise on migration and development issues. If you would like to know more about how KNOMAD works, please write in the chat. I'm sure Dilip would be happy to elaborate in more detail. But now I will pass the floor to you, Dilip. You're just muted.
Thank you, Milda and Aida. Great to see everybody here and my co-panelists. Great to see all of you. I just wanted to say a word about KNOMAD, which stands for Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, and we are glad to be hosting this event. KNOMAD is a multidisciplinary brain trust for the global community. So whatever knowledge we produce for policy making, mostly it is in the public domain, and we do collect primary data, and it's a huge network of people. That's what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
So if you want, you can actually now also start with your talk for today.
Okay. So I will then talk about the major question of remittance costs, and the importance of remittance flows. I just am having some issues here with my screen, but okay. So so we are all familiar with the sort of the latest data we have in the public domain. I say that about the public domain because we are about to publish a new data on remittances on November 30th. And the data I would cite today would be not from the new data, but the old data that is in the public domain. The low and middle income countries received 630 billion plus in 2022. The year is not over yet, but they are on track to receive 630 billion plus. in the low and middle income countries. Globally, the number is more like 800 billion. And even in the low and middle income countries, if you include the true size of remittances, the dollar amount is significantly larger. More likely, it's $1 trillion market. But the important part about remittances is that they are flowing in small transactions. Like you can have a $200 transaction, which is probably more the average size, $200 per month. But often people are now beginning to send $50 or sometimes $70, $80. That wasn't possible before when cost of sending money was high. But since costs are falling a bit, especially through digital means, people are now able to send smaller amounts. And the lowest amount that I heard about a cross-border remittance was somebody sending $13. It was a cross-border transfer to Kenya. And yeah, I mean, one would wonder why one would do that. But with small cost, it is possible that, my family in India is having lunch or dinner or suddenly needs something. And I could actually literally transfer the cash real time, $10 or $20 to them, if the costs are low and the technology is appropriate. So we are moving in that direction, but we are still far away from that. And the cost of sending money on average is about 6% now, according to the remittance prices worldwide database of the World Bank. But if we look at specific corridors like sending money to Africa somewhere from Europe, the cost can be very high. From Japan to almost anywhere, from South Africa to almost anywhere, sending money through banks in particular can be 13-14% costs. I have seen costs like 18% for sending money. So you send $100 and the other side receives like $82 only. So high cost of remittances are a drain on remittances and on poor people's money. And that is especially so in sub-Saharan Africa, where the needs for any kind of external help and help from the family is very, very important. So what are some of the reasons for high costs? Obviously, the first one is a lack of competition in the remittance market. Not too long ago, remittances were considered small change and they were ignored by everyone. And now we know that remittances at 630 billion plus flowing to low and middle income countries are larger than entire foreign direct investment flowing through multinational companies. And remittances are more than 3 times the size of total official development aid. So it's not being ignored anymore, and glad to know that it has really gone into the mainstream development discussions. And indeed, in the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, there are 2 specific indicators relating to remittances. One is to increase the size of flows. That's SDG indicator 17.3.2. That's as a means of financing sustainable development goals. And a second one is to reduce remittance costs to 3% by 2030. That's SDG indicator 10.C.1. So one of the reasons why costs are high is lack of competition in the market. And lack of competition comes from partly fragmented markets. So small island economies, of course, there is not enough scale to do the investment in operable systems, efficient systems. So cost tends to be high. But actually, lack of competition is also a phenomenon everywhere in the world, including the US and Europe and India, and you name the country and it is there everywhere. So why is there a lack of competition? I think one part is simply that the industry does not have interoperable systems. So one company doesn't share its platform with another company, and there is no public, so to say, public rails, public payment infrastructure that is open to all, so people can jump in and out, and costs could be lowered. That isn't there, and that also reduces scale and increases monopoly. But there is even a bigger factor, which is the lack of competition. A bigger factor behind lack of competition is the fact that many national post offices and banking systems in the world, both developed and developing world, they have exclusive partnership with specific money transfer agencies, and that obviously promotes more oligopolistic or monopolistic behavior and lack of competition. One roadblock, which is really a sticking point, and I don't see the end of it anytime, is the so-called compliance requirement for know your client or for combating money laundering and financing of terror. And because of that problem, that some of the remittance transactions could be misused for wrong purposes, if the law enforcement authorities, the regulators go after the financial institutions, that is the intermediary for that transaction or those transactions, then often the financial institution has a huge reputation burden as well as financial burden. They can go out of business. So what the correspondent banks are doing is to actually cancel the license of existing money transfer companies if they think that their line of business is not very lucrative. Mostly it is actually driven by profit motive, but they cancel the contract in the name of risk or in the name of de-risking, meaning that they want to avoid that risks. And that also is a phenomenon for not letting new companies, especially technology players, the money transfer operators who are using digital channels of sending money, even through mobile money or something, new entry with efficient technology, new entry of firms with new technology, that is also constrained by the fact that banks don't want to open bank accounts for these people for correspondent banking. So what can we do about this particular sticky point? I think we have to sort of take the view, and that's the reality. It's not a view, it is really a reality, that we need to recognize small remittances as not money laundering. Small remittances are not money laundering. If we do that, that would unleash a huge force in terms of entry of new players, and that would de facto become the payment rails for the whole world. It would be amazing. So that would be my recommendation on that. And there was a question about research gaps. I don't have a lot of time to talk about that. I would say that we need to improve data on remittances. If we didn't know that remittances are 630 billion and more than 3 times the size of official aid, we wouldn't be talking about it today. So we need to improve data, and there is a lot to be done. So we have started under KNOMAD and in collaboration with 45 countries and IMF and Eurostat, a Remit Start working group. It's a working group to improve data on remittances, and we are actually progressing quite a bit in terms of thinking through where are the issues, and there are 6 themes that we are monitoring. So that's an important initiative to be watching out for. Besides the recognition of small remittances as not money laundering, which is a central policy message I would have, we need to actually show the regulators the data on that. So developing risk metrics on money laundering and financial terrorism incidents, risk metrics on that. What is the probability that a transaction of certain kind would have the risk of money laundering or of financial crime or terrorism? That sort of a metric is needed, and business schools can do a wonderful job there with their students, with their smart students. Financial inclusion is a must, because yes, we can go to the moon. We are again thinking about sending people to the moon. That is today's news from NASA. And we still have about 2 billion people, 1.4 billion adults in the world without a bank account. Without a bank account, of course, you cannot use mobile wallet or mobile phone or anything. Okay, so that I would say is really a priority to improve financial inclusion. And combined with small remittances to not money laundering, I think that can actually provide access to digital means to billions of people. And that is when remittance costs would drop. And as you can imagine, on $1 trillion volume, so to say, if you reduce cost by 1%, that's $10 billion. If you reduce cost by 3%, that's $30 billion. $30 billion is about the amount of aid that Africa receives, sub-Saharan Africa receives. And that is about the aid that the largest donor country in the world provides on an annual basis. So this is a low-hanging fruit. Thank you.
Dilip, thank you so much. I know that there will be audience questions for you, but we will leave those for the end because we have 3 other great speakers. But I already can suspect some questions, on the sticky point, as you said, because I saw among our participants people from compliance and anti-corruption backgrounds. So I'm very happy that you brought up that provocation about laundering. And I will actually now hand over to John Cantwell. John is Distinguished Professor of International Business at Rutgers University. His research spans the fields of international business and management, economics, economic history, economic geography, philosophy, and innovation studies. And he has also served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal for International Business Studies, which, as many of you know, is the leading journal in the international business scholarship. So John, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Milton. I appreciate that. I think Eleanor is going to share my slides, and I'll speak to those. But by way of introduction, beyond what Milda has just said, actually it's quite interesting that you mentioned my previous role in GIBS, because I'm going to refer also to the journal a bit later on. My overall area of research, my focus has been on innovation and international business, or IB. I think we need to go back in this deck of slides. We seem to be quite well advanced in the slide. There we are, right at the start again. Thank you, Eleanor. So my overall area of research is innovation and IB, and this has led me particularly to look at patterns in international knowledge networks that characterize international business increasingly in our current era. So if we can move to the first proper slide. Thank you, Eleanor. So what we've observed, myself and a recent doctoral student of mine, Salma Zaman, is that increasingly it's the case that local innovation networks, innovations within a local area, local metropolitan or city area, depend upon and are enhanced by the international relationships and the knowledge-based connections of that city, of the people in it. And so what we observe among city innovations in cities in terms of their innovation performance is that those cities that have been better connected, better knowledge connected, also do better in terms of their overall performance. The degree of transmission of knowledge, ideas, and the scope for entrepreneurship and innovative activity within the location itself. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And this is particularly true, we argue, in this information and digital age, that knowledge-based connections now are much more important than they were in the past, but they matter to a greater degree. So, for example, in the earlier era of mass production and large-scale companies, you tended to see a relationship, for example, with the notion that local clusters were essentially geographically bounded. Representative of that type of idea would have been somebody like Beccattini in Italy, who described the Italian industrial districts as essentially entirely local affairs. What we find instead now in the information age is that the most dynamic local areas are those that are best connected. And the spread of these global cities is not just in terms of the knowledge acquisition that they're able to achieve, but also in terms of where the major nodes of knowledge generation are. So increasingly now a range of emerging market cities are included in these webs or networks, as illustrated in the next slide, where we see here, this is just a network-based diagram. You can see all the major global cities here that have been increasingly interconnected via knowledge flows, technological knowledge flows between them. So if we go to the next slide. Now, how is this achieved? Well, one of the ways in which it's achieved, which is well reported in the international business literature, is through foreign direct investment and multinational companies, and indeed through some of the activities of the local clusters or communities themselves. These, I think, have both been quite well studied, but we're arguing that increasingly significant in this international connectivity that we've observed is the role of what we could call international epistemic communities in particular fields. These often connect knowledge across space and across different city areas. So if we move to the next slide, as an illustration of an international epistemic community, we could give our own international business field of scholarship. And so this is where I do refer back to my time as editor of the Journal of International Business Studies. And we reported in an article we did on the impact of migration within our own field and in linking together scholars in the international business domain. And what we found, looking at the authors in JIBS, the leading journal in the field, is that over 50% of all the authors were employed outside their country of birth. In other words, they were migrants. Christos and I actually are examples of this. Me from the UK in the United States, and Christos from Greece in the UK. And no doubt many of others joining us would find themselves in a similar position. And even if we looked at the remaining 50%, just under 50%, that were employed in their country of birth, 12% in all were returned migrants. In other words, they had been internationally mobile at some time or another. So this just shows the role of migration in these connectivity that we observe in these international epistemic communities. Now, we also know that migrants, skilled migrants especially, tend to be concentrated in urban areas, which, as I've just been suggesting, is where much innovative activity these days is based, and these are the cities that then become more connected. So we can see the role of migrants in achieving this intercity connectedness, that it's been estimated, for example, that in 1 in 5 migrants, about 20% of migrants live in just 20 cities worldwide. And within those cities, international migrants, those that were foreign born, represent around 20% of the total local population. And indeed, where I am now in New York City, that share of foreign born population is even higher. And so there again, we see this critical role, very likely, of migrants in establishing connectivity of a major global city. So the next and last slide, some work that I've done with another former doctoral student, Pallavi Shukla, now still in Rutgers. This was an article in JWB. And we looked particularly here, and this again has not often been done, at the role of what we call transit migrants, those who are temporarily abroad for one reason or another, often on visas in another country. And these play a particularly critical role, we think, in the sorts of patterns of connectivity that we've just been reporting upon. And our finding in this study was essentially that transient migration in particular plays a vital role in establishing the connection between different institutional systems across countries, and in our case, across the major cities that may well be resident, as it were, within an institutional structure that is rather different, and therefore has a rather different knowledge system to that of the other place. And so migrants are great connectors of these different institutional structures of knowledge, and therefore they enormously facilitate, we believe, the connectivity role that is played by international epistemic communities. So I shall, I think, conclude there. I think that was about the right time, hopefully. Thank you, Eleanor and Milda.
So thank you very much, John. And I think now over to Chris. Chris is Professor of International Business and Sustainable Competitiveness at the University of Leeds. His research interests lie in foreign direct investment, international political economy and finance, theory of the firm, and migrant remittances. He has consulted and designed policies for international organizations, national governments, NGOs, and businesses. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I decided to only show one slide from one of our papers. Elena, if you could show the slide, and then try to organize my discussion around this slide. Can we have the slide, please? Thank you. Okay. Now, this is a framework that we have used in a relatively recent publication with two of my co-authors on inward foreign direct investment, migrant remittances, and new venture creation. And basically, the key argument here is that foreign direct investment is positively linked to remittances, both directly and importantly through new venture creation. New venture creation operates as a mediating variable. Building on IB theory, we also look at IB-related or commonly used variables like governance and corruption, which we used as mediating variables, both moderating variables, both in terms of their direct effect on migrant remittances and through their impact on FDI, hence build the hypothesis that you can see there. We used a very extensive database for mid-level emerging economies, and basically a significant number of control variables that derive from the literature. Now, I don't want to talk so much about this. I use it as a framework for the discussion. I was asked in particular to comment on the link between FDI and remittances and also of the challenges. I start very quickly with the background. The background of this paper and this similar work is the PhD thesis of one of our co-authors, Pitelis, and who has done with a PhD at the University of Leeds. That really looked at the interface between developing economics and IB, and subsequently there was a focus on the impact of remittances on development with some co-authors from Leeds, and then this paper in particular on the interface between remittances and FDI. Now, the interface between remittances and FDI is mostly to do with a more dynamic production-based entrepreneurial approach as compared to the more sort of static, comparative static approach that is used in developing economics. In economics. Before I come to the issue of the interface between developing between the FDI and remittances, I will actually start with the challenges, because the challenges are a huge issue in remittances. They are both conceptual and measurement. I was very pleased to see the discussion about the cost of remittances. This is a huge issue. I'm always jealous of people who manage to focus. I find it very, very difficult to do so. When it comes to challenges, there are very serious conceptual challenges, including who do we define as a migrant, what do we define as remittances, and even what we define as FDI, how these things are interrelated, and the interaction of all of these things. Just to give you an example, I would focus, there are many issues to discuss here, but from all of this, the most important is when we are talking about remittances, the focus tends to be on pecuniary or financial issues, but remittances is much, much more than this. And that much more than this, which in the literature is called social remittances, but I personally define it more like intangible remittances, and they have to do with the transfer of ideas, the transfer of innovation, new business models, and all of these things are, in my view, more important and more relevant for IB theory. When it comes to measurement, a major issue is the informal channels and the cost that has been discussed. And in general, there are both under and overestimates. For example, to give you a very strange example, all the salaries that go to expatriates are considered as remittances, even if this in organization and businesses, even if these people do not remit anything. On the other hand, there are underestimates for the reason I mentioned, notably because of informal channels, etc., etc. So really, whether remittances are underestimated or overestimated remains a moot question. Although on balance, I think they are underestimated for mostly because of the informal channels. We all have experiences and many examples of this. Now, in economics, the main focus on tempered altruism versus a portfolio approach. And this approach is mostly based on exchange, that is consumption. It's comparative static and looks at the whole thing at the relationship between remittances and other financial flows, mostly in terms of substitutability. And I personally think, we think, in this context, they consider that the impact can be positive. There are many positive impacts on education, on housing, on human capital, on demand, and a number of things, but there are also positive negative effects, like a dependency culture, and like, for example, the so-called Dutch effect, that is when, because of remittances, there is a dependency and therefore lack of interest in development. We take the view that some of these things are looked more from a comparative static view. And if you look at it from a more entrepreneurial production and dynamic point of view, it's more to do with complementarities rather than to do with substitutabilities. Now, there are dozens of ways through which either individual migrants or organizational migrants contribute to what we call business and ecosystem and market co-creation. And this is a situation where basically, through remittances and through the osmosis of ideas between migrants and those remaining at home, there is a dynamic situation where the one supports the other. And when it comes, for example, to FDI, remittances help subsidize, finance small and medium-sized enterprises, therefore the supporting and complementary ecosystem that is built around FDI by multinational firms. Similar effects are in the case of individual entrepreneurs. There are dozens of examples in our paper. We refer to some of this and a lot of anecdotal evidence. All of these things suggest that if you look at it more from an IB perspective, the relationship is more one of complementarity. And also, if you look at it from this point of view, what becomes more important is basically the intangible effects rather than the tangible aspects, the financial aspect of remittances. All of these things are opening up absolutely huge opportunities. I mean, it's almost difficult to cover the whole potential of this literature. I mean, it is about the impact on sustainable development, it's the link with environment, climate change, health, It's no time to discuss about all of these issues, but it's not just, although only 3.5% of the population are now migrants, those who plan to migrate in the next 20 years are almost 14%, according to some estimates. Climate change is leading to a situation where people from hotter countries are going to places in colder countries. That leads to, but these countries tend to be more developed. That increases the carbon footprint of all of these people. And all of these dynamics are extremely interesting. So besides addressing the limitations that have to do with conceptual and measurement issues, which are important, for how, for example, you define students. Some countries are defining students directly as from the very beginning as immigrants, migrants. Some define them as migrants only for the first year. All of these things have effects. They have to be dealt with. But once these things are resolved, there is a wealth of issues that have to be can be explored, including other moderating and mediating factors that can impact on this relationship, and basically how to create win-win co-creation enhancing policies by governments and regulatory authorities. So huge opportunity for research. Thank you very much. Sorry if I took a bit longer.
Chris, this was absolutely perfect. And actually the chat is on fire. So, but we will still save the questions from the chat to the end, and we hope we'll get to some of those by the end of the webinar. I am delighted to introduce our final speaker today, Mathias Czaika. Mathias is professor in Migration and Globalization at the University for Continuing Education Krems and a former director of the International Migration Institute at Oxford University. And his research includes drivers and dynamics of international migration processes, migration policy, and migration of highly skilled workers, asylum seekers, and refugees. So Mathias, over to you.
Thank you very much, Milda and Ida, for inviting me to join this fascinating panel discussion, and for contributing some thoughts on the topic of mobility barriers and economic globalization. I'm a migration researcher, having looked a lot into the role of migration policies, in particular in shaping international migration processes. And I'd like to share a few aspects, a few snapshots on that type of research. Let me start with, my slides move. No, they don't. Oh, no, okay. Let me start with a few sort of charts here. Basically, the main domains of economic globalization, namely the cross-border flows of goods, capital, and people. So here you see charts on global migration, the rise of global migration stocks, now at about 280 million international migrants, so living in another country than their country of origin or a country of birth. Global trade increasing, obviously with some cycles, but still on a continuously rising trend. Then similarly, global travel, so short-term travel, including tourism, really on a steep rise. This is obviously not the latest figure. There was obviously a very short sort of dip in travel during the beginning of the pandemic, but this is now back to the previous trend. So numbers are really rising on international traveling, now at about 1.4 billion border crossings a year. And in the lower right, you see charts on the trends on global FDI, ODA, so official development assistance, and remittances. Basically what Dilip Ratha has already been mentioned. Also there on these capital flows, really a steep increase in in the volumes. So my question I would like to talk briefly about is, how are these sort of cross-border flows of goods, capital and people actually influenced by mobility barriers set up by states? I like to start with this sort of map here. I mean, when we look at just global numbers, the picture doesn't immediately appear that we see here, that actually international migration is not an opportunity, an equal opportunity for everyone on the globe. It's very clustered. It's very concentrated in a number of regions and geographical areas. You see them illustrated here with a European migration cluster, with an North American cluster, with a Middle East Gulf cluster, and a few more regional clusters on the African and the Asian continents. So very, very diverse in that sense, the global pattern, very concentrated. About 10 destinations, international destinations, host about half, so about 140 million of the international migrants. John Cantwell has mentioned that, you know, a quarter of international migrants are hosted even by 2 dozens of cities. So very, very clustered destinations of international migration. But at the same, similarly at the sending side, about a quarter of all international migrants are only coming from less than 10 economies or countries. So also there, you know, quite some strong concentration. Interestingly, and that's also a trend, international migration flows are increasingly educated, if I may use this term, which means educational levels of international migrants is increasing continuously. About 1/3 of all international migrants are now tertiary educated. Sometimes use also the term highly skilled. Not sure if this is the right term, but that's how it is often used. So what we can say about this global picture is that migration has globalized, as you know, other cross-border flows. It has mainly globalized from a destination country's perspective, but hardly from an origin country's perspective, with migrants, you know, migrating from an increasingly diverse array of non-European origin countries, concentrating in a rather small and, yeah, for some periods even shrinking pool of prime destinations. So this global migration map is very, very skewed. It's very spiky, if you like. So rather than refuting the idea of a global migration or globalization migration hypothesis, it rather reflects the kind of asymmetric nature of globalization processes more generally. So why is that, and how does it come? So let's look into policies that may actually play a role here, in particular migration policies, and I focus here primarily now on visa policies. So policies that address travelers and tourists and business people. This is here a map for the European Union, or more specifically the Schengen area, and it shows, you know, those countries and nationalities that require a Schengen visa in order to enter the European Union. And you see, it's green and red. It's very structured. It's very clear cut, and it only reflects, you know, global structural inequalities. When we look at the global map and a more long-term trend, we see here, again, visa requirements measured by an indicator that we call visa restrictiveness, which is basically the percentage of nationalities that require a visa in a particular destination. And you see that these patterns have changed also to some extent over the recent decades, the last half century or so. But what's interesting is that it's not what is often perceived the northern or western or the wealthy and high income countries that are most restrictive when it comes to visa policies, but it's the less developed, the low income destinations that have a higher level of restrictiveness with regard to inbound travel and with income mobility regulations. When it comes to privileged groups from OECD countries, so OECD citizens, basically, you see a clear divide here in this graph with regard to outbound visa restrictiveness. So here clustered by continents, you see clearly that OECD citizens have a much more of a free way into Europe and the Americas, but less so into African and Asian destinations. Rather than a clear, global divide or dichotomy here, what's more appropriate to describe is that we see a regionalization in mobility spaces and areas. And when you look at here regional economic communities and integration process, we see very clearly that obviously first and foremost European Union being very much in a region or an area, an economic area which is internally open, due to the Schengen Agreement, but externally relatively restrictive. That's not as restrictive as many other regions in the world. You see here quite some differences when it comes to internal and external openings and closures across these regional communities here. So now let me briefly talk about the role of migration policies in affecting migration processes, and in my next slides about or with regards to travel, trade, and FDI. Let's start with migration. This is based on a quite large N study. We've done testing basically the role of visa restrictions on migration inflows and outflows. So basically also on circulation. And I think it was also John Cantwell who has mentioned the importance of transient migration and mobility. So the back and forth of people that are connecting places, that are transporting and transmitting in some ways not only resources, economic resources, but also ideas and knowledge, etc. So what we find here when we test the role of visa policy restrictions is that obviously it reduces the volume of inflows. We estimate here an effect of 26 to 68%, depending obviously on respective context and destinations, but also similarly an effect, and that's interesting, I think, also an effect on outflows. So less outflows as a reaction, as a response to an immigration on sort of an admission restriction or a restriction on inbound mobility. This taken together obviously has an effect on the intensity of circulation. So it's a clear negative effect on circulation as a response to visa policy restrictions. Now, what kind of economic implications does this have? When we sort of estimate the elasticities, so the effect of a 1 percentage point increase in GDP growth, for instance, in destinations with regard also to different countries of origin and their effects on the effects of migration flows in bilateral diets, we see that in visa-free corridors, this sort of growth effect or the pull-in effect of economic growth obviously is much stronger than in visa-restricted corridors. So 0.9% versus 0.1%. But also the effect is larger when it comes to outflows. So less outflows as a response to GDP growth at destination in visa-free corridors than in visa-restricted corridors. So overall, we find that basically migration restrictions here measured and operationalized through visa policy restrictions sort of neutralizes the business cycle effect. So sort of the decrease the negative effect on overall migration and mobility, not only inbound but also outbound. So less reactions on market mechanisms and on the signals that the labor market imbalances may send to migrants, both potential migrants abroad and also migrants, and with regards to their return intentions, migrants in the host countries. Now, to move to the areas of international travel, trade, and FDI. Here we have at the global level. So here we tested a global matrix, and not only a cross-sectional, but a panel data matrix over the last 40 years for 194 destination countries. And we test what's the effect actually of visa restrictions on cross-border movements, international travel, and we see it's clearly negative, minus 22%, less international travel as a response to visa restrictions. The effect is stronger for low-income destinations. Here we distinguish between high-income and low-income destinations. So the effect is stronger. So when low-income countries sort of set up a mobility barrier, the effect is much stronger than in high-income countries when it comes to international travel. When it comes to trade, bilateral trade, we see the overall effect is significantly smaller, only a quarter so about 5% less in trade as a consequence of a visa restriction. And on FDI, if it's about 12%, so a bit higher than on trade, but less than on travel. We have also studied, since John Cantwell has mentioned scientists and knowledge carriers, we also tested the effect on scientific mobility. There, the effect is about 3 to 6% less scientific mobility, so mobility of researchers and scientists as a consequence of visa restrictions. Here, some additional regressions on the change of policies of visa introduction versus visa removal. Here we see clearly that visa introduction has a much stronger immediate and short-term effect than in the opposite direction of a visa removal. So it takes longer actually to recover from a mobility barrier in order to get back to levels that usually characterize visa-free corridors. And here my last slide, basically, where do those go to that are deterred to some extent by visa restrictions? Here we looked at deflection effects, so spatial effects of visa restrictions. We see that those who move or are sort of shifted to other visa-free destinations when it comes to travel is relatively minor, 0.1%, basically as a consequence of a visa restriction, and it's not even significant for trade and FDI. So very little, basically spatial diversion or deflection effects of a policy of a visa policy restriction. And similarly, when it comes to deflection to other visa-free destinations, obviously it's a bit higher. So the deflection from a visa constraint to a visa-free destination, but still not significant for FDI. To conclude, visa restrictions generate a number of unintended consequences. I don't go much into that. We have done a lot of research on these sort of unintended consequences, where, for instance, deflection to irregularity, so creating new forms of migration, in particular irregular forms of migration, generally a smuggling business, pushing people into permanent settlement. So these are all well-documented effects of migration policy restrictions. But, and that's what I think is most relevant for this sort of discussion today, it also interrupts or sets up a barrier for international mobility and migration circulation. So how does it work? Mostly through the effect, or what does it imply? Mostly an effect on sort of labor market supply and demand mechanisms. Here, the market mechanism, the international labor market mechanism is to some extent sort of influenced and not working as efficient as a sort of kind of a context where, like in the European Union, where people and laborers could actually move freely without any mobility barriers. And obviously that implies also less transnational economic activity, less trade, less investment, and less scientific collaboration and knowledge transmission. And last point, liberal migration and mobility policies can enable, in particular, and can benefit most actually rather the poorer countries. As we have seen, they suffer most by restrictive policies, by their own policies, I must say, and more liberal policies on that end would definitely enhance their integration into the global economy. Thank you very much.
There are so many questions in the chat, and I think one of the questions I collected is for Dilip. The first one is from Irem from Loyola University, Maryland, and Irem wanted to know: do you think new technologies such as wider use of blockchain technologies can be a solution to increase remittances? Are there studies or centers that research this?
Yes, a good question, I suppose. I don't know if you are all following what is happening with FTX. This is bigger than the Lehman moment for the crypto world now. The fall of Lehman, what it did to the global financial crisis. FTX crisis is now going to, looks like, make the crypto world implode, at least for a while. But more generally, I would like to make a point that blockchain is different from cryptocurrencies. Blockchain can help, and indeed it is already being used in some partnerships between some money transfer companies and some blockchain or crypto companies. I won't name names. They're nascent, will take some time before it really gets mainstreamed. And it is not doing the right thing, which is literally transferring value. They're using the blockchain part of it, not the cryptocurrency part of it. Now, the cryptocurrency, you have many kinds. The one that is more likely to be applied with some effectiveness in the space of remittances, and effectiveness in the sense of reducing costs and increasing the speed, and getting around some barriers like capital controls in countries that do have a very large number of immigrants or emigrants, both ways. So that the one with the most potential is the stable coin, and within that, central bank digital currencies. So the future is that central bank digital currencies will be the one in this space, if at all. And even then, there'll be the issue that central bank digital currencies are not always superior to cash. And in the area of, they are superior to cash in terms of handling costs and programmability. But the programmability part itself is a weakness of central bank digital currency. So now think about the Russia-Ukraine situation, and the way the plug was pulled on the SWIFT transfers through sanctions on the SWIFT transfers to Russia. After that, how can you have countries joining into any kind of international payment systems, which is programmable, and somebody has access to the switch other than you, that is. So I think we are heading into a multipolar world there, and there has been a setback in the progress of central bank digital currencies and stable coins. And the space of crypto coins itself, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and there are several thousand, 10,000 plus cryptocurrencies out there. The volatility and the time it takes for doing a transaction on chain is going to cause problems. Okay, I'm getting too technical, I suppose. So I would like to say that no, I have not seen the light yet on using cryptocurrency or using blockchain on a scale on remittances.
I believe it's not too technical at all, given the profiles of our audience. So thank you so much. And actually, Dilip, there are many more questions for you in the chat. Every speaker has a lot of questions. So what we'll try to do is we'll just pick one for each speaker right now to have a full round, and then we'll see depending on how much time we have left. And Stacey Fitzsimmons from University of Victoria, Gustafson School of Business, initiated a conversation in the chat on lower skilled migrants, and that just took off a life on its own. But the initial question was from John Cantwell, and she said she's curious about the benefits of lower skilled migrants, and she mentioned an incident in this year's Academy of International Business conference where a senior panelist implied that lower skilled migrants are not so much of international business issue because they do not contribute to knowledge flows. And Stacey said that didn't seem right to her. And we already saw a lot of posts in the chat with different rebuttals. But John, would be great to also hear from you or any other panelists. What do you think? How do lower skilled migrants contribute to international organizations, business organizations?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Milda. I've also noticed that there are so many reactions to this in the chat. It's difficult to follow and to keep cognizance of what's going on in the webinar at the same time. So I haven't checked all of it. There's a very long conversation here, including some replies by my co-author Pallavi, which is probably helpful. And I noticed as well, there is another question from I think somebody called Czaika, which is somewhat connected to this, I believe, because he has asked me, are the lower skilled migrants in particular, influencing the globalization debate by promoting some kind of resistance within the recipient societies, populist outbursts and so on. And I think particularly if I can link some of the things that Pallavi has said in the chat to that kind of question, which is that I think a good deal of what matters here is that we shouldn't be separating out to the degree that is sometimes done, and perhaps is being done in this conversation, low-skilled and high-skilled migrants as if they're completely different categories. I think there is often a relationship between these two. And this relationship is particularly strong, I believe, in those places that I was emphasizing in my discussion, and which Mathias has picked up on as well, which is some of these major global cities that are hubs for migration. Now, in those global cities, we have both skilled and low-skilled migrants. We have a mix, and there's a relationship between them in the sense that where they're from common countries of origin or cultural backgrounds, they often meet in those contexts. And this is what Pallavi and I have described as the scope or the potential for forming a critical mass, which then makes the kind of institutional connectedness with their background societies that we're talking about much more viable. So in this context, as I think Pallavi has commented on in the chat, low-skilled migrants can play an extremely valuable role in connectivity, even if they themselves are not doing these international knowledge connections, but they're constructing new institutional forms within the relevant cities that help to make the connections possible. And where I think, on the other hand, we might have a problem of the kind referred to by Czaika is where there is a kind of relative isolation of low-skilled migrants and an absence of higher skilled, right? This is in many of the more rural areas, and exactly what we see in America, to answer Czaika's question, and in the UK with Brexit, the Brexit vote, is that it's not in the cities, it's not in the places of general migration that we observe these kinds of resistance and populism. It's in the rural areas where there may not be so much migration, and what there is essentially just low skill, right? That's where you begin to get the divisions and the frictions arising that lead to these populist movements. So what we have to talk about here, I think, is the urban-rural divide and its relationship with migration to properly understand what's going on. All right, I think I've more than used my time in answering that question, but it was a difficult but important question, I think. Thank you, Milda.
Yes, please, Mathias wanted to.
But just really endorsing what John said, just to emphasize here, there's never an either or. So it's never sort of a kind of the it's never possible really to have high-skilled migration, high-skilled immigration without low-skilled immigration. These two types of forms are functionally connected, mainly through two ways. One is high-skilled migrants. They need, in a segmented labor market, they need low-skilled labor for domestic work, for care, for cleaning, etc., all on construction, etc. So there is the functional link. I think mainly, and I think that's often the misperception in the public space, but also in policy making, that we can sort of purely select, and keep get the wanted migrants in, the best and brightest, how they're often called, and keep the unwanted, the irregular, low-skilled or unskilled migrants out. That's not going to work. That has never worked, and it's not working because these are functionally related. When high-skilled migrants enter a destination, they create a demand for low-skilled labor. So there's the segmentation of labor markets is only reinforced through the immigration of high-skilled migrants. And as you've seen, about a third of international migrants are tertiary educated, are highly skilled, and that creates the demand for low-skilled labor.
Can I say something?
Please, Chris.
Just a second to say that I think the term low skill, high skill should be dropped altogether. It's very confusing. There are very small percentage of working population that they are all low skill, and they are a very low percentage that you might define as high skill. Everything is in between. There is a huge middle there, and much of it depends on supply and demand. If anybody thinks that my plumber is unskilled, you have to see my latest bill. Have to see my latest bill, and you will see. And if you think that some of people with 3 degrees are skilled, look at their latest salaries. I mean, we need a better term. I don't have it at the moment, but the term is very misleading.
Thank you very much, Chris. Maybe I will ask now a question for Mathias. It was a question from the chat, and it's: are outflows reduced due to the reciprocal visa policies by other countries?
No, because obviously someone who has the citizenship of a particular country of origin obviously is not affected by a visa requirement. Visa requirements are for foreigners, for foreign nationals. So return obviously is unaffected by retaliation. Basically, obviously there is retaliation. We find that about 70% of bilateral bilateral corridors are sort of similar in their visa policy. So there's some retaliation on, but also obviously. So the effect on outflows, which is mostly return, obviously is not affected by that retaliation. It has to do with the possibility to re-enter a country. So that's the reason why people don't leave a country, as smoothly or quickly or easily once immigration policy has become more restrictive. So in order to avoid the hassle, to re-enter a country after one has left, creates this kind of push into more permanent settlement. That's what we observe. People stay longer in their country of destination if immigration policies gets more restrictive. Exactly the opposite what many decision makers and policymakers would like to see through immigration. So net immigration, that's what we've seen in the UK as well, is actually increasing as a consequence of more restrictive immigration policies.
Which I think it's fascinating, Mathias, for many of our listeners. Actually, the question was from Maria Ahmad, who is at IOM UN Migration. So I think your answer is of great value there. I have one more question for Chris, and I think we'll then do another round because, as the speakers rightly noticed, there is so much happening in the chat. We will also save the chat and make it available to anyone interested by email, because there's a great conversation happening there. But Chris, this question is from Rafael Corredoira, and it's back to the FDI question. So he said, if I understood correctly, inward FDI could drive migrant remittances up because of an accounting rule. Have you identified other ways inward FDI could be impacting migrant remittances?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I don't quite understand the issue, the question about accounting rule. If I mention anything like this, it's me managing to confuse everybody. This is not the intention. The intention was to say that FDI actually creates opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises that they are supporting and complementary of their major activities. There are case studies that we have used in papers, like, for example, in a paper with David Tees on the issue of McDonald's and how McDonald's, when they went to Russia, in effect, they have co-created, in fact, in the beginning, single-handedly created the fast food market there, first by creating the Max complex, which was producing everything internally, and then gradually outsourcing to local producers that they were supporting. Some of them gradually became multinationals themselves. So it's a co-creation process, and often remittances are actually helping this co-creation process by providing the finance for this, especially in countries where there are institutional voids, so to speak, or there are gaps which make it difficult for them to get finance from banks. I mean, so basically it is a process of what we call market and ecosystem co-creation, whereby new ventures are created with the support of remittances in order to facilitate investments by to support and complement investments by multinational enterprises. I mean, that could range from a canteen next to a multinational or to a hairdresser, to actually major suppliers, like in the case of McDonald's, that gradually become multinationals themselves. So the whole thing is a dynamic of ecosystem co-creation. It's not an accounting thing.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Aida, did you want to have a question for Dilip?
I one question from the chat. Like John said, it's difficult to look at the chat and listen to the speaker, so I'm not noting who asked what, but thank you very much for the question, and I will read this now. So, point on financial inclusion, can you comment, it's for Dilip, on how financial inclusion or the lack of it breaks down between men and women? Are women more likely to be excluded than men? If so, what should be done to address this gap?
The Findex, global Findex database of the World Bank actually, I think, says that it has data showing that women are more excluded than men. I don't have the data, but it's available on the web. What can be done? I mean, it's a whole gender agenda, and I will just make a general point rather than specific that, there is a general point about empowering women, but there is also another general question in the other direction. Do bankers want to work with men or women? In fact, there is a bigger question. Do bankers want to work with poor people? So you can break that down. Do bankers want to work with poor people, and especially poor women, more than poor men? And I think the answer is that they neither want to work with poor people, whether they're men or women, and especially they might even have issues working with women. In some parts of the world where there's a large number of presence of lower skilled people in the workforce, we are talking about 90% of population. 90% of the population of those places sometimes are foreign workers. In those countries, these issues are even more important. So that's a general answer to that question. But there was an interesting question, which might be that this was from Bangladesh, from Mr. Mohammad Mubarak Hussain. And this could be of interest to others as well. The question, I think, was, what are 5 things that Bangladesh can do to promote inflow of remittances? it's a catch-all question and very pertinent to many countries. I would say first, recognize that small remittances are not money laundering. Do it unilaterally in Bangladesh and then go out and try to persuade everybody in the world, starting with whoever is the best partner you have. So small remittances are not money laundering, number one. Number two, promote financial inclusion, especially of migrants who are lower skilled and who might be in irregular status in terms of visa, overstay, or just being illegal, so to say. Third, which is very pertinent to Bangladesh, but it is also true to many, many countries in the world, is the whole issue of worker paid recruitment costs. It costs a lot to get a job in a foreign country, especially for poor people. We are talking about many poor people paying a labor agent the equivalent of $5,000, $7,000, equivalent of about 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years of expected wages. I'm talking about 5 years of expected wages in the foreign country. They pay it upfront now in places like Bangladesh to get that visa to go and work as a construction worker, for example, somewhere. So that is a huge problem, and the UN SDGs, again, Sustainable Development Goals, have an indicator to reduce worker paid recruitment cost. If we are able to reduce that down, then the remittances that would be sent in the first few months or years by the migrant worker would actually go to the family as opposed to labor agents. And all of that payment is illegal anyways. So that would be the third recommendation. Fourth is exclusive contracts between national post offices and money transfer companies, national bank branches, bank systems, and specific money transfer companies. Change the exclusivity contract to renegotiate it and make it inclusive partnership, and insist that at least two, maybe partnership should be with at least 2 money transfer companies, maybe more. So that would be the fourth one. And the final one is that because remittances are private money, you don't want to tap it, directly tax it, or say that money should be used in one way or the other. That wouldn't work. But you could actually tap diaspora savings through diaspora bonds, which is a bond financing mechanism, predictable financing mechanism, longer-term financing mechanism for financing all sorts of development programs and projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dilip, for getting to this question, because that was actually the next one we wanted to ask you. So thank you for all the 5 points. It's really great. I have one more question back for John, and this is again one of those questions where the chat just took off and people actually answered and commented, themselves. But maybe you could just add your thinking on returnee migrants. So, what policy measures should turn them more into assets? And this was a question from Rizal Karim from University of Malaya, where I believe in Malaysia it's past midnight now. But he asked, whether returnee migrants are assets or burden, and if they're assets, what policy measures could be helpful there. And we want to thank Pallavi Shukla already for tackling that question in the chat, and several others, but maybe John, you have a couple more ideas?
Yeah, thank you, Milda. Perhaps I can also address at the same time another question in the chat that I think is related, which was a question about the role of, just to elaborate on the role of transient migrants. That was a question from Sonia Plaza. And I think these questions are somewhat related, because a critical function in what we've been talking about, which is the role of migration within the establishment of knowledge-based connectivity in international epistemic communities, in other words, across space, is the capacity for mobility. In other words, where in the case of transient migrants, people are moving between places, they're establishing linkages, right? Both as transmitters of knowledge and ideas, but also as receivers. So they're making connections effectively between the place in which they normally reside and the place in which they're visiting, if they're transient migrants. And if they're return migrants, clearly between the country of residence that they were once in and the return to the country of origin. So in each of these cases, they're establishing more systematically what we could call an international epistemic community. The international epistemic community doesn't come from the sky. It comes essentially from these real movements of people that are integrating and connecting across space and making this a reality. So, you know, to give the example that I was giving earlier from our own international business field, most authors these days are involved in collaborative research. You know, years ago, only about 10% of journal articles were co-authored across countries. Now it's in international business, it's more like 80%. And even in the mainstream science and engineering disciplines, it's over 70%. So this has become the norm. And this is the establishment of these relationships between people that gives an identity to the community in exactly the same way that we've talked for a long time about local communities or clusters, where Marshall used to say, you know, the knowledge is in the air. Well, the knowledge is in the air in our community too. It may be global, but it's interconnected due to these kinds of movements. So where people move back and forth between areas, they're temporarily co-located with other researchers with whom they may or may not be working. There is an interchange of ideas and knowledge, which is very important and which helps to establish a community-based identity. And so both return migrants and transient migrants, I think, play a critical role in the kinds of process of connection that we're talking about. Just finally, since the original question was also about policy-related issues, related to the policy, of course, is exactly the question of, is the migration, particularly skilled migration, is it a brain drain from the country of origin, or is it a brain gain? Is it a diaspora that then, as it were, benefits from a greater degree of brain circulation? And that depends exactly on this issue of, is there some element of return migration, and is there some element as well of mobility and transient migration that's entailed in these processes? Because where it is, from a policy perspective, that's going to work much better. That's going to be where you get the brain gain and you get these community-based relationships forming up where the diaspora can actually play a role. So you may still be located abroad, but you're now more connected because some of your colleagues have gone back. You've gone back, but you still have links in the country in which you were temporarily resident, etc. So in other words, this kind of inter-society awareness that is brought by these processes, I think, is critical to establishing linkages between what otherwise might be institutionally grounded and therefore so-called sticky knowledge. But the knowledge becomes less sticky to the extent that it becomes part of a community base and is held in common amongst the members of the community.
I have one final question, and this question is for Mathias, and it's also meant to bridge the disciplines. And, you know, migration studies so far have looked at macro level, how policy impacts migration flows, if I'm correct, and the micro level, aspirations and capabilities. Have you included in any work that I'm not aware of, the firm level, how firms are redirecting, reshaping, and influencing the migration flows, especially like multinationals that are employing the migrants? Is there work on this? Because if there is not much work on this, I think this is an area where we could interconnect to move the field forward.
That's exactly right, Ida. I think that's a very obvious research gap here. I think migration research, migration studies has very much overlooked the role of firms, of intermediaries. I mean, there's a notion of organizational migrants, a term coined by Lea Lucassen. So that's sort of migration that takes place within organizations, could be multinational companies, could be the army, right? Could be faith-based organizations that send people to other places abroad for that type of migration, the migration that is organized by a higher entity or by some sort of organizational unit, obviously where the agency is not fully with the migrant, but also with the entity as such. That's studied to some extent, but obviously we haven't fully understood, the ways these sort of decision-making units, the individual and the organization, sort of interact in that process. Intra-company transferees, obviously, that's something that's sometimes looked at, but still, I think, very little research. So the answer is yes, Ida. Here we should really connect business studies and migration studies in order to identify, some areas, and this is exactly one where, firm mobility and individual mobility sort of go hand in hand or sort of interact in a functional way.
I also think for IB scholars here among us, it's an area, and I think hopefully Chris and John agree with me, where we could also export our knowledge to the migration domain and also to the domain of the policy. So, but I think we are now finishing. So I would like to thank you a lot to the speakers and also to the wonderful audience and also to all the questions that have been raised in the chat. Thank you very much. Also special thanks to Elena Karali from University of Leeds and Roman Simon from Vienna University of Economics and Business for all the backstage support in preparation for this webinar.
Yeah, and I can just double what Aida said. We could continue for half an hour, if not a couple of hours more. The chat has been extremely alive. We're glad that we chose chat as an option instead of questions and answers, because we saw that, somebody from the World Bank answered a question posed by somebody from a business school, and somebody from the corporate world answered a question posed by somebody from an NGO. So we could not be happier about that. We will download the chat and make it available to anyone interested. And we are quite sure that this conversation will inspire our colleagues from different universities to work on these important issues and hopefully include them in their teaching as well, where it's often missing. And if you're from a different sector, if you're from policy or business, we also hope that you found a lot of food for thought. If you would like to stay connected with us, I put the email of our network, Migration Network @wu.ac.at in the chat. And again, thank you to all the wonderful speakers, and to the audience. We will see you next time. So thank you so much for joining us.